The Alpha's Human Mate, written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Man on the Road. The rain came down in sheets, the kind that blurred the world into watercolor. Harper Wells tightened her grip on the steering wheel, muttering about cursed country roads and her own questionable life choices. Somewhere between the empty highway and the forest line, a shape darted across her headlights. She hit the brakes hard enough to make the tires shriek. The truck skidded to a halt, heart pounding against silence. Then she saw him, a man sprawled in the middle of the road, barefoot, soaked, and breathing shallowly. For one stunned moment, Harper just stared. His skin was streaked with mud, his clothes torn like he'd been dragged through a battlefield. When his head turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of his eyes, amber, glowing faintly like a reflection of the storm's lightning. Her instincts warred with reason. It was late, and she was alone. But leaving him there felt unthinkable. Great, she muttered to herself, climbing out into the rain. This is how people die in horror movies. He was heavier than he looked, but somehow she managed to drag him into the truck. The second his skin touched hers, a strange jolt moved through her arm. Not pain, but something deep and unsettling, like a sound too low to hear. She ignored it. The man needed help, and she had no time for weird sensations or glowing eyes. The drive to her cabin took 10 minutes, though every second stretched. She talked to him just to keep herself calm, filling the silence with sarcastic rambling about bad weather, her unlucky timing, and how her sister Lydia would call her an idiot for picking up a stranger. He didn't respond, only breathed slowly, almost peacefully. Inside the cabin, she laid him on the couch. The fire she'd left smoldering earlier was nearly out, so she coaxed it back to life. The light fell over his face, revealing sharp, symmetrical features that didn't belong to a man who collapsed on rural roads. He looked expensive somehow, even covered in dirt, his jaw strong, his lashes long enough to make her feel personally offended. She fetched a towel and first aid kit. His pulse was steady, strong. A shallow cut ran across his ribs, already closing on its own. She blinked and leaned closer, wondering if she was just tired. The wound sealed like time was moving wrong. Harper sat back and pressed her fingers to her temples. "Right," she said softly. "Totally normal. People heal like superheroes all the time." The man stirred, his lips parted, voice rough and low. "Harper." She froze. The sound of her name in his mouth sent a shiver down her spine. "You're awake?" she asked, startled. But his eyes stayed closed, and the word seemed like a dream escaping him. She frowned. "You don't know my name, buddy," she whispered, "unless you read my wallet while dying, which would be rude." The absurdity of talking to an unconscious stranger finally hit her, and she laughed quietly to herself. Maybe Lydia's right. Maybe I am losing it. When she checked on him again a few minutes later, his breathing had evened out. Exhaustion pulled at her too, so she threw a blanket over him and retreated to her room, phone in hand, trying to call for help. The signal flickered uselessly. The storm had knocked everything out. She sighed, tossing the phone aside, unaware that in the next room, the man's eyes opened briefly, bright, unnatural gold, before fading back to human amber. Morning came late and gray. Harper woke to the smell of coffee that she definitely hadn't made. She stumbled into the kitchen, hair a nest, to find the stranger standing there, awake, dressed in a clean shirt she didn't own and looking infuriatingly composed. "Good morning," he said, voice low and smooth, as if making coffee in a stranger's house was entirely reasonable. Harper blinked. "You were unconscious in the rain on a road. I nearly hit you with my truck." He nodded, perfectly calm. "You didn't. Thank you." "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "you're welcome, but you owe me an explanation and probably a carpet cleaning." His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "My name is Kellan Thorne. I was hiking. Got caught in the storm." She eyed him. "Barefoot in November?" "It's complicated." "Right," she said, pouring herself coffee. "I bet it is." The conversation trailed into silence. He moved with quiet precision, every motion measured, like someone used to control. The air around him felt charged, not threatening exactly, but intense enough to make her heart forget its rhythm for a second. She hated that. He was too calm for a man who'd supposedly collapsed on the highway. "So, Kellan," she said, setting down her mug, "where exactly were you hiking? Because unless you enjoy getting lost in private property, you were about 10 miles from the nearest trail." He hesitated, and something flickered in his expression, something old, guarded. "I was tracking someone." Harper raised an eyebrow. "What are you, a park ranger?" "Something like that." The way he said it ended the conversation without needing to raise his voice. Harper recognized that tone. It was the same one her late father used when talking about subjects that weren't up for debate. She decided not to push it. Still, part of her wondered what kind of man spoke like he commanded armies and made coffee like he'd been doing it for a century. He stayed at the cabin through the afternoon while the storm cleared. Every time she looked at him, that faint pull returned, like gravity had shifted in his direction. She tried to dismiss it as attraction. He was objectively gorgeous and she wasn't blind, but it felt heavier than that. Too instinctive. Too familiar. When Lydia called that evening, Harper lied, saying she was alone, because explaining she'd taken in a mysterious forest man sounded insane even for her. Yet as she hung up, she caught Kellan's reflection in the window. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the forest, jaw clenched, body still, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of a howl. It rose and fell, distant yet sharp enough to raise goosebumps. Harper glanced at him. "Wolves?" "Just the wind," he said too quickly. Later, when she finally went to bed, she told herself she'd drive him to town in the morning, drop him off and forget all about it. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound outside made her restless. She dreamed of golden eyes in the rain, and somewhere between waking and dreaming, she heard a voice she couldn't name whisper through the dark. "Mine." She woke with the sunrise cutting through the curtains and the unsettling thought that her life had quietly changed while she wasn't looking. Chapter 2. The Stranger Who Stayed. By morning, the storm had softened into mist, the kind that clung to the windows and blurred the line between forest and sky. Harper moved through the kitchen with cautious curiosity, half expecting to find her mysterious guest gone. But there he was, standing at the counter as if he'd lived there forever, barefoot, steady, and quietly folding a dish towel. The smell of coffee drifted through the cabin, rich and annoyingly comforting. Harper lingered by the doorway, still not sure whether to thank him or call the police. He looked up before she could speak, that same composed calm flickering in his amber eyes. He had an unnerving way of making stillness look deliberate, like every breath belonged exactly where he put it. The conversation was brief, polite, and utterly strange. He thanked her again for helping him and offered to fix the broken gutter outside as repayment. She told him not to worry, though secretly she couldn't decide if she was more intrigued or irritated by his manners. Who nearly dies on a highway and then volunteers for home maintenance? When she went to the cafe later that day, her mind kept drifting back to him. The image of him standing in her kitchen, shirt slightly rumpled, voice low and sure. It lingered in ways she didn't like admitting. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately. Her younger sister's radar for emotional chaos was unmatched. "You're distracted," Lydia said while icing cupcakes. "You've got that look, the one you had when you found that stray dog and tried to pretend you weren't in love with it." Harper rolled her eyes. "He's just strange. I picked him up after the storm. He's staying for a bit." Lydia froze mid-icing. "You brought home a strange man from the woods? Do you at least know if he has a job? A pulse? A last name?" "He's fine," Harper muttered. Though even as she said it, she realized how absurd it sounded. Lydia began listing possibilities. Cult member, escaped convict, vampire, with a kind of enthusiasm only a caffeine addict could maintain. Harper tuned her out, staring instead at the line of trees beyond the cafe windows. When she returned home, Kellan was outside fixing the gutter, sleeves rolled to his elbows, movements precise and graceful. For a fleeting moment, she simply watched him. The sunlight caught his hair, gold and bronze at once, and she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. A tug, quiet but insistent. He noticed her watching. "I hope you don't mind," he said, without looking down from the roof. "You mentioned it was broken." "Not at all," she replied quickly, clearing her throat. "Though I'm starting to suspect you're just trying to work off your mysterious forest guy guilt." His mouth curved slightly. "Maybe." It wasn't a real smile, but it lingered long enough to be disarming. She retreated inside before her cheeks betrayed her. As evening settled, she caught herself humming while cooking dinner. It had been a long time since she'd shared her space with anyone. The cabin suddenly felt warmer, though she refused to admit why. She served 2 bowls of soup, pretending it was an act of charity and not domestic impulse. They ate mostly in silence. Every now and then he'd glance up, eyes unreadable, as if studying her. She tried not to notice the way he handled his spoon like someone unfamiliar with casual gestures. When she joked about it, he tilted his head, almost amused, like he was trying to remember what laughing felt like. After dinner, Harper insisted he take the spare room. He nodded in quiet gratitude but didn't move immediately. Instead, he studied her, like she was something fragile and important. "You shouldn't have stopped that night," he said quietly. "It could have been dangerous." She shrugged, folding her arms. "So could leaving you there." Something flickered behind his eyes. Respect, or maybe surprise. "You're brave," he said finally. "I'm reckless," she corrected, half smiling. "There's a difference." When she turned away, she didn't see the faintest trace of gold ripple through his gaze, or the way his fingers flexed slightly, as if restraining something deeper. Later that night, Harper lay awake listening to the wind whisper through the trees. Every creak of the floorboards made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was because she wasn't used to having company. But part of her knew that wasn't it. There was something about him, something just beyond reason, like gravity pulling at the edges of her world. In the guest room, Kellan stood by the window, eyes fixed on the forest. The faint sound of distant howls carried through the mist. His wolf stirred, restless, whispering through the mind link he kept severed from the pack. "She doesn't know what you are." "She should. She's ours." Kellan closed his eyes, breathing through the ache of it. "Not yet," he answered silently. "She's not ready." The wolf's response was low and impatient, more emotion than word. He ignored it, watching the lights of the cafe flicker faintly in the distance. Humans weren't meant to be tangled in the ways of alphas. And yet, when Harper's laughter had drifted from the kitchen earlier, something inside him had settled for the first time in years. Morning came quietly. Harper woke to find a small note on the table in clean, deliberate handwriting. "Fix the fence. Don't go out alone after dark." She laughed under her breath. "Bossy," she murmured, shaking her head. But when she opened the door, the scent of pine and rain carried something else. A trace of him that lingered in the air long after he'd gone to the woods. It shouldn't have mattered. He was just a stranger, a man she'd rescued out of misplaced compassion. And yet, as she stepped out into the cool morning light, she couldn't help but feel like she was walking into a story that had already begun without her. Chapter 3. The Pull of the Moon. The week passed in quiet rhythm, a kind of uneasy peace that neither Harper nor Kellan seemed ready to disturb. He stayed longer than planned, though he never said why. The excuse changed each morning. Repairs to finish, supplies delayed, the road too muddy for travel. But the truth lay in the way he lingered near her cafe window each evening, his gaze following her without meaning to. Harper noticed, of course, it was hard not to. The man had the subtlety of a thundercloud, and the posture of a soldier pretending to be a tourist. Still, she told herself it was harmless. She was used to people drifting in and out of her life, travelers, customers, the occasional lost hiker, but no one had ever looked at her like he did. Not with hunger exactly, but with an intensity that made her pulse skip and her sarcasm sharpen as defense. The cafe had become his unofficial territory. He sat in the corner seat every morning, reading a battered notebook, occasionally helping fix broken chairs or stubborn coffee machines without being asked. The regulars adored him, though they whispered about his strange quietness and the way animals went still when he walked by. Lydia loved him instantly, of course, convinced he was a forest ranger or maybe an undercover movie star. Maybe he's researching for a role, she told Harper one afternoon, wiping down the counter. You know, rugged man learns to feel again through the power of caffeine and baked goods. Harper rolled her eyes, pretending not to smile. Right. He's definitely the emotional type. Probably cries at sunsets. Yet that evening, when she locked up and found him outside repairing the cafe sign that had been broken for months, she felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. He didn't say anything when she thanked him, just nodded and offered one of those fleeting half-smiles that always felt like more than they should. They fell into an unspoken pattern. She teased, he tolerated. She joked, he almost laughed. Sometimes when she caught his expression softening mid-conversation, she'd feel that same electric hum she'd felt the night she found him. She brushed it off, pretending it was curiosity and not something dangerous. But there were moments, brief and disorienting, when she sensed something else beneath his calm. His eyes would flick toward the tree line, his body going perfectly still, as if hearing a sound she couldn't. Once she found him outside at midnight, standing shirtless under the silver wash of the moon, breathing like he was trying to contain something vast. She'd frozen in the doorway, torn between fascination and alarm. He hadn't seen her, but the sight of him, barefoot, shoulders tense, eyes glinting faint gold, haunted her dreams for nights afterward. The next morning, Lydia noticed the dark circles under Harper's eyes. So, when are you confessing your tragic love for our mystery handyman? She asked, pouring herself far too much sugar into her coffee. Harper snorted. There's no love, tragic or otherwise. He's just staying until the road's clear. Uh-huh. And I'm the queen of the forest, Lydia said. Face it, you've got the hots for him. It's fine. He's like illegal levels of attractive. Harper muttered something about sisters being the worst invention in human history, but Lydia's grin didn't fade. She'd always been able to see through Harper's defenses, which was exactly why Harper avoided eye contact and buried herself in work. That evening, Harper found Kellan fixing the porch railing again. It was already perfectly fine, but she didn't mention it. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't watching, the way the muscles in his arms shifted with every movement. You know, she said, most guests say thank you and leave. You're setting dangerous precedents. I don't mind, he said simply. His calmness unsettled her. He never flirted, never pushed, but his silence carried weight, like he was letting her come closer at her own pace. When she handed him a glass of lemonade, their fingers brushed, and that familiar spark flared between them again. This time, neither looked away. For a heartbeat, the world felt too still. Then Lydia's voice echoed from inside, asking if anyone had seen her phone charger for the 10th time that day, and the moment cracked like glass. Harper stepped back quickly, mumbling something about dishes, while Kellan turned toward the forest, jaw tightening. Later, when Harper locked the cafe for the night, she found Kellan waiting by the truck. The moon had risen, full and heavy. He seemed tense, shadows cutting along his cheekbones. Don't go walking alone after dark, he said quietly. I've lived here my whole life. The worst thing in these woods is a raccoon with anger issues. Still, he said, gaze steady on hers, promise me. The seriousness in his tone unsettled her. She nodded despite herself. He gave a small nod of approval and disappeared into the trees like the night itself swallowed him. Hours later, Harper lay awake again. The forest outside hummed with sounds she couldn't name, low, distant, and almost rhythmic. Curiosity won over reason. She slipped on her coat and stepped outside, following the faint silver glow of moonlight across the clearing. The woods felt alive, humming under her feet. Then she saw movement, a shadow, darting between trees. For a second she thought it was an animal, but then the shape straightened, unmistakably human. Kellan. He stood half-lit by moonlight, his shirt discarded, the pale gleam of his skin almost unreal. His body trembled, muscles tense as though containing invisible fire. The air around him shimmered faintly. His head snapped up, eyes flashing gold. Harper froze. The sound that followed was low and guttural, not quite human, not quite beast. Before fear could take root, Kellan turned and vanished into the darkness, faster than any man could move. She stood there long after he was gone, heart thudding, breath shallow. Somewhere deep down, a truth she didn't want to believe began to unfurl. When she returned to the cabin, Lydia was asleep on the couch, snoring softly. Harper sank into a chair, staring out the window at the tree line. The echo of that golden gaze burned into her mind. Whatever Kellan Thorne was, he wasn't just a lost hiker. And no matter how much she wanted to pretend otherwise, she wasn't sure she wanted to know the truth. But beneath her confusion, beneath the flicker of fear, something warmer stirred, a reckless, impossible pull toward the man who made the night itself hold its breath. Chapter 4. The Secret Beneath the Skin. Morning came too bright for Harper's fragile sense of denial. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was sunlight creeping through the blinds, slicing across her messy kitchen. The second was Kellan, very much human again, sitting at her table with a cup of coffee like nothing remotely strange had happened in the woods the night before. He looked maddeningly composed, hair damp, clean shirt clinging to him just enough to make her brain short-circuit. She wanted to march over and demand an explanation, but part of her suspected he'd just stare at her with that infuriating calm and somehow make her feel ridiculous for asking. Instead, she shuffled in wearing mismatched socks and yesterday's sweater, muttering something about coffee being sacred. He glanced up as if he'd been waiting for her. "You were outside last night," he said quietly. Her hand froze on the mug. She wasn't sure whether to lie or throw him out. "I couldn't sleep," she said finally, though her voice betrayed her. He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his gaze, then returned to his coffee. "The forest isn't safe on nights like that," he murmured. "You don't say," she replied, unable to help herself. Between the howling and the mysterious men turning into Olympic sprinters, I was getting that impression. He almost smiled, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, as though her sarcasm amused him more than it should. That, more than anything, disarmed her. How was she supposed to stay irritated at someone who looked like an apology wrapped in broad shoulders? Lydia burst in before Harper could press the issue, wearing pajama pants and holding a phone like a weapon. "Okay, don't panic," she began, which of course meant Harper immediately did. "But there's a rumor going around town that wolves were spotted near the cafe last night." Harper glanced at Kellan, who remained perfectly neutral, which only made him look guiltier. Lydia, oblivious, continued rambling about local gossip and possible werewolf sightings, clearly thrilled by her own conspiracy. Harper wanted to crawl under the table and stay there forever. After Lydia left to spread chaos elsewhere, Harper leaned against the counter and sighed. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" He looked up at her with quiet seriousness. "I told you the forest isn't safe." That wasn't an answer, and they both knew it, but the way he said it, soft, protective, like every word weighed something, made her chest tighten unexpectedly. Whatever he was hiding, it wasn't out of malice, she could feel that. And maybe that scared her most of all. She decided to distract herself with work, but the day was useless. Every time the cafe bell rang, she half expected him to appear. When he finally did, just before sunset, she pretended not to notice the way her pulse jumped. He ordered black coffee like always, sat in his corner, and quietly repaired a broken chair leg she hadn't asked him to fix. Lydia stopped wiping tables long enough to whisper, "You know, if you don't marry him, I will." "Please don't," Harper muttered. "I'm pretty sure you'd explode from his silence alone." But the truth was, she couldn't stop watching him either. There was something magnetic about his stillness, like he was listening to a world no one else could hear. Every time he looked at her, even briefly, it felt like gravity changed direction. That night after closing, she found him waiting by her truck again. The air was cool, thick with the scent of pine and rain. He said nothing at first, just studied her face as though searching for something he couldn't name. "You shouldn't walk home alone," he said finally. She crossed her arms, feigning nonchalance. "And what exactly do you think is going to attack me? The world's most aggressive raccoon?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the faint gold halo flicker in his eyes when the streetlight hit them. The moment stretched, quiet, and strangely charged. Her breath caught, but she refused to look away. "I just want you safe," he said softly, and then he was gone, melting back into the trees, as if the forest itself claimed him. That night, Harper sat awake again, her mind a storm. Every instinct screamed that something about him wasn't normal, but beneath that unease was curiosity, and beneath curiosity was the strange, unwelcome ache of missing him. By morning, she'd almost convinced herself it was infatuation mixed with sleep deprivation. She opened the cafe early, needing distraction, only to find the entire pack of elderly regulars whispering about fresh paw prints near the fence. Lydia was photographing them for her blog, naturally, while Kellan stood nearby, expression unreadable. When their eyes met, she raised an eyebrow in challenge, daring him to deny it. To her surprise, he didn't. He just gave her that quiet look again, half apology, half confession, and said, "Sometimes the wild gets closer than we expect." Lydia squealed that it was poetic and suspicious, but Harper could barely hear her. The words lingered long after he left, and for the first time, she realized she wasn't afraid of his secrets. She was afraid of how much she wanted to be part of them. That evening, she walked the familiar path toward her cabin, moonlight soft through the pines. The world felt different now, alive, listening. Somewhere in the distance, she thought she heard a howl rise, low and mournful, before fading into silence. Harper smiled to herself, shaking her head. "It's just the wind," she whispered, though the flutter in her chest told her she didn't believe it. And deep in the forest unseen, Kellan watched her go, his wolf restless beneath his skin. "She's not ready," he told himself again, even as every instinct screamed that she already belonged to him. Chapter 5. The Fence Between Us. The next morning arrived with a crisp, deceptive calm that felt too ordinary for the chaos Harper's mind was still untangling. She stood outside her cafe with a cup of coffee, staring at the forest as if the trees owed her answers. They swayed gently in the wind, giving nothing away. Somewhere beyond them, she knew Kellan was awake too, probably fixing something that didn't need fixing, probably thinking too much just like she was. By the time she drove home that evening, she had decided two things. First, she was absolutely not falling for a mysterious forest man who might or might not turn into a wolf under moonlight. Second, she was definitely falling for him anyway. Denial was easier when she had customers, but alone in her cabin, every silence felt filled with him, his voice, his eyes. The strange gravity that made her feel seen, in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her fence, however, had other plans. It had chosen that day to collapse in spectacular fashion, leaving a section of her backyard open to the woods. Harper glared at it, muttered a few unrepeatable words, and fetched her toolbox. She had barely picked up a hammer before a shadow fell over her shoulder. Kellan. He carried a roll of wire fencing like it weighed nothing, his shirt sleeves pushed up, hair tousled by the wind. He looked like he'd stepped straight out of one of Lydia's ridiculous romance novels. Only this one smelled faintly of pine and quiet authority. "Your fence was down," he said simply, setting to work without waiting for permission. Harper opened her mouth to protest, but there was something so absurdly capable about him, measuring posts, tying wire, moving with silent efficiency, that she just gave up. "Do you ever stop fixing things?" she asked finally. He looked up briefly, the ghost of a smile threatening to appear. Only what's broken. Cute, she muttered, pretending not to blush. They worked side by side for the next hour. Or rather, he worked and she mostly passed him tools while trying to look useful. Every time their hands brushed, something small and electric jumped between them, subtle enough to make her question if it was real. The air between them felt charged in a way that wasn't entirely explainable by attraction. Lydia arrived halfway through with iced coffees and an arsenal of intrusive questions. "So," she began cheerfully, "are we doing manual labor together now? Is this like foreplay for people with tool belts?" Harper nearly dropped her hammer. "Please leave." Kellan kept working entirely unbothered, though Harper caught the slight twitch of his mouth. Lydia was too entertained to stop. "I'm just saying," she continued, sipping her drink, "this is exactly how those home renovation romances start. The brooding man with mysterious scars shows up to fix something, and the next thing you know, there's emotional healing and a kiss in the rain." Harper pointed toward the road. "Goodbye, Lydia." Her sister left only after snapping a few photos for memory. Harper groaned, while Kellan quietly tightened the last wire. The finished fence gleamed neatly in the late light. "Thank you," she said, exhaling. "I owe you dinner or something." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "Well, too bad," she replied, hands on hips. "I'm cooking. Try to stop me." He didn't. He just watched her for a long moment, something soft and curious in his eyes, then nodded once. Dinner turned out better than expected, mostly because he insisted on helping. She discovered he could chop vegetables with alarming precision and made tea like it was a ritual. The two of them fell into a rhythm, wordless and strangely easy. Every now and then, she caught him glancing at her, and her heartbeat tripped over itself in protest. When they finally sat down, Lydia's words echoed annoyingly in her head. Maybe this really did look like one of those ridiculous romantic setups. The thought made her laugh under her breath. "What?" Kellan asked, his tone gentle. "Nothing," she said quickly. "Just thinking how strange this is. You fixing fences, me making dinner for a guy I found half dead on a road. It's not exactly the usual love story." He tilted his head, his voice quiet but steady. "Maybe the unusual ones last longer." The comment slipped into the air before either of them could pretend it wasn't intimate. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, the silence warm instead of awkward. Harper felt something uncoil in her chest, slow and unfamiliar. When the dishes were done, Kellan stepped outside, his expression thoughtful. Harper followed, drawn by the cool night air and something else she didn't want to name. They stood by the repaired fence, the forest stretching out like a shadowed sea before them. "It's quiet tonight," she said softly. "For now," he answered, his gaze distant. "The forest changes before the full moon." She frowned, hearing the faintest tension in his voice. "You say that like you know it personally." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked at her the way one might look at a secret they weren't ready to share. "Some things are easier to understand from the inside," he said finally. The cryptic answer should have annoyed her, but instead she found herself smiling. "You really don't do normal conversation, do you?" His eyes glinted faintly in the moonlight. "I'm learning." That was enough to make her laugh, the sound spilling easily into the night. She didn't realize how close they were standing until the laughter faded and her breath hitched. The distance between them was barely a heartbeat. For a moment she thought he might move closer, but he didn't. He just looked at her like he was memorizing her face, then turned back toward the trees. "Good night, Harper," he said quietly, the words gentle but weighted. She watched him walk into the shadows, his figure merging with the dark until he was gone. Back inside, Harper leaned against the door and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The repaired fence gleamed faintly through the window, solid and strong, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the boundary between her yard and the forest. It was the fragile line between reason and something wild that was already calling her name. Chapter 6. The Things We Don't Say. The following days unfolded with an ease that felt both strange and fragile. like walking across thin ice without hearing it crack. Harper tried convincing herself that Kellan's presence was temporary, that once the forest dried and the roads cleared, he'd vanish as quietly as he had arrived. Yet every morning there he was, repairing something, drinking his black coffee in the same corner of the cafe, offering small nods instead of good mornings that somehow meant more. Her regulars adored him now. Old Mrs. Calloway started referring to him as Harper's lumberjack fiancé, and no amount of denial seemed to change her mind. Lydia encouraged it naturally, adding dramatic flourishes to the story whenever possible. Harper, meanwhile, tried to maintain her dignity, though it was difficult when Kellan's very existence turned her insides into static. He had that rare kind of quiet confidence, the kind that filled a room without a single word. The worst part was how effortlessly he fit into her routine. He'd fix a loose shelf before she noticed it was wobbly, refill the coffee beans when she was distracted, and vanish into the woods just when she started feeling brave enough to ask about him. One afternoon she caught him leaning against the cafe doorframe, sleeves rolled up, sunlight turning his hair the color of honey. He looked too comfortable, like he belonged there. That realization made her heart stumble. She dropped an entire tray of spoons in response. The clatter was deafening. He looked at her, amused but polite, as if waiting to see whether she'd laugh or combust. She chose the former, though the sound came out too high-pitched. Lydia, from across the counter, was grinning like a cat that had found the cream. By evening, Harper was pacing around her cabin, berating herself for acting like a lovesick teenager. She told herself she'd just talked to him, asked the questions that had been haunting her. But when he knocked on her door right after sunset, all intentions dissolved into chaos. He'd brought firewood, of course, always fixing, always helping. His eyes softened when he saw her expression, half nerves, half irritation at her own inability to stay composed. "You looked cold earlier," he said simply. "That's because it's winter, not a cry for help," she muttered, taking the wood from him. Her sarcasm, once a shield, now came out more as self-defense against how gently he looked at her. They ended up sharing dinner again, though neither had planned to. The meal was simple, soup and fresh bread, but the silence between them carried a current that kept Harper hyper-aware of every sound, every shift in the air. She asked about his work, his home, the vague idea of where he came from. His answers were honest but partial, like puzzle pieces without edges. She noticed how his eyes flickered away each time the topic veered too close to truth. Something in her wanted to push harder. But another part, quieter, softer, knew he'd tell her when he could. Instead, they spoke about small things. Her cafe regulars, the best pie flavor, Lydia's hopeless matchmaking. At one point, Harper said something teasing about his expressionless calm, and finally, he laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was real, and it felt like the sound filled every corner of the room. It startled her how much she liked it. Outside, snow began to fall in soft, slow flakes. The world looked peaceful, almost unreal through the window. Harper found herself tracing patterns on the fogged glass while he watched her with quiet fascination. She wasn't used to being looked at like that, not as something fragile, but as something precious. When she turned back, their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the air between them felt too close, too fragile. He looked like he wanted to step closer but didn't. She looked like she might let him. Neither moved. The silence said everything. Words couldn't. Lydia chose that exact moment to call, shattering it spectacularly. Harper fumbled with the phone while Kellan smirked faintly, retreating to the fireplace. Lydia, of course, demanded an update on the romantic wilderness saga, which Harper denied through gritted teeth. When the call finally ended, Kellan was staring into the fire, his expression unreadable. "She worries about you," he said quietly. "She worries about everything," Harper replied, sitting beside him. "Mostly about my tragic taste in men." He gave a small sound of amusement low in his throat. The warmth between them deepened, not from the fire, but from something wordless that had been building since the storm. For a while they just sat there, the fire crackling softly. His presence filled the space like steady heartbeat rhythm, reassuring, unspoken. She wanted to ask what he was thinking, but feared the answer. Instead, she leaned her head back and whispered, "You don't talk much, do you?" He turned to her, eyes catching the light. Sometimes silence says more. And for once she understood exactly what he meant. When he finally stood to leave, she followed him to the door. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. He hesitated, glancing back at her as though about to speak, but then only nodded once, a wordless promise of something neither of them could name yet. After he left, Harper lingered by the door, heart unsteady, smiling despite herself. Every sensible part of her knew she should be cautious, but every other part whispered that caution had already lost the fight. Somewhere beyond the woods, under the quiet glow of moonlight, Kellan looked back toward her cabin, his wolf stirring beneath his skin. The bond that tied them hummed faintly, alive, undeniable. And though he knew the truth would one day break the fragile peace they'd built, he couldn't bring himself to stay away. For both of them, silence had said too much already. Chapter 7. Secrets in the Moonlight. Snow dusted the ground like powdered sugar, turning the sleepy town of Ashbourne into a postcard scene no one had ordered. Harper watched the world outside her cafe window and tried, very unsuccessfully, not to think about Kellan. It was an impossible task. Even when he wasn't there, he somehow was. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door, his scent faint in the air. Pine. Smoke. Something darker that had no right to smell as good as it did. He'd been distant the past few days, disappearing into the woods for long stretches with vague explanations. She told herself it was fine. He wasn't hers, and she wasn't the type to pine over mysterious men who probably had entire forests of secrets. And yet, there she was, staring at the window, hoping he'd walk through the door like a scene from some dramatic movie. Lydia would definitely mock her for watching. As if summoned by the thought, the bell over the cafe door chimed. Kellan stepped inside, his hair damp with melted snow, cheeks touched by cold. He looked both too wild and too calm for this little town, and every head turned toward him as though gravity had shifted. Mrs. Calloway elbowed her friend and whispered something scandalous. Lydia, behind the counter, mouthed, "You're welcome," as if she had personally summoned him with matchmaking magic. Kellan's gaze found Harper instantly, and the rest of the world seemed to recede a little. He ordered coffee, though he didn't need to. She already knew how he took it. When she placed the mug in front of him, their fingers brushed. It was brief, but her pulse went off like someone had struck a match. He noticed, of course he did. His expression didn't change much, but his voice softened when he spoke. "You shouldn't be out late tonight." Harper frowned. "Why do you always sound like you're quoting a survival guide?" "The full moon," he said almost absently, like it explained everything. She laughed it off. "You make it sound ominous. What happens? The wolves start paying property taxes." The corner of his mouth twitched, and for once he didn't correct her. Instead, he looked away toward the snow gathering outside, his jaw tightening. Something about the silence that followed made Harper's humor falter. He wasn't joking. Whatever it was that lingered behind his calm facade, it was pulling at him tonight more than usual. When he left, she watched him go until the door closed, feeling that same strange tug in her chest, a mixture of worry and a pull she didn't have a name for. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately. "You're in love," Lydia announced, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. Harper almost dropped the coffee pot. "I am not." Lydia just smiled like someone who'd read the end of the book before anyone else. "You're making hard eyes at him every morning, and now you're defending his mysterious midnight forest walks. Classic denial." Harper groaned, waving her off, but deep down she couldn't deny it anymore. There was something about Kellan, his quiet steadiness, the way he seemed to listen even when he said nothing. He made her feel grounded and dizzy all at once. That night the world outside felt alive again. The sky was silvered with the kind of moonlight that made everything seem too sharp, too vivid. Harper was locking the cafe when she heard it, the faint echo of a howl, distant but unmistakable. It sent a shiver down her spine, half fear, half something else entirely. She should have gone straight home. Instead, her curiosity, ever stronger than her good sense, led her down the path toward the woods. The air grew colder with each step, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. Somewhere ahead, branches cracked and she froze. For a heartbeat, she saw movement, a flash of silver fur, a shape gliding between trees too large to be real. Then it was gone. Her breath caught. Logic tried to reason its way through what she'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of light. Maybe she was tired. But her instincts whispered something wilder. And then he appeared, Kellan stepping out from the shadows, hair mussed, eyes catching the moonlight in a way that made her chest tighten. He didn't look surprised to see her, only resigned. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. "You say that a lot," she replied, trying to steady her voice. "What's in there, Kellan? What are you hiding?" He hesitated, his silence stretched heavy as snow-laden branches. Then he stepped closer, close enough for her to see the faint shimmer in his gaze again, the one that wasn't human. The world felt suspended between heartbeats. "There are things about me," he said softly, "that you wouldn't believe." "Try me," she whispered, though her pulse was roaring in her ears. He smiled faintly, sad and fond all at once. "You always say that right before danger finds you." Harper wanted to push him, demand truth, but something about his tone stilled her. She didn't understand what he was, not yet, but for some reason, she trusted him. That realization scared her more than the sound she'd heard in the woods. When she finally turned back toward the path, she could feel his gaze following her, warm against the back of her neck. Part of her wanted him to stop her, to confess whatever secret kept his eyes so guarded. But he didn't. He only whispered something low that the wind almost carried away. "Stay safe, little human." She didn't hear him, not clearly. But later, lying awake in bed, that same voice echoed faintly in her dreams, deep, steady, threaded through the sound of distant howls. And for the first time, Harper realized the truth wasn't something she wanted to uncover anymore. It was something she wanted him to trust her with. Chapter 8. What the Night Revealed. Morning broke reluctantly, the kind of gray winter light that blurred everything into quiet tones. Harper hadn't slept much, her dreams haunted by flashes of silver fur and the memory of Kellan's voice. Low, careful, threaded with something almost sorrowful. She moved through her kitchen in a daze, burning her toast twice and nearly watering her coffee instead of her plants. Lydia, of course, noticed immediately when she arrived to help open the cafe. "You're doing that thing again," Lydia said, leaning against the counter with her arms folded. "The thing where you pretend you're fine while your face screams, 'I've just witnessed something cinematic and emotionally confusing. Spill it.'" Harper's mouth opened, then closed again. "I thought I saw something in the woods last night." Lydia perked up instantly. Was it him shirtless again? Because if it was, you're welcome for manifesting that. "It wasn't, well, maybe, I don't know." Harper rubbed her forehead. "There was something, like a wolf, but not. And Kellan showed up right after, all mysterious and moonlit, like he's auditioning for a supernatural perfume commercial." Lydia stared at her, eyes wide with theatrical delight. "Oh my God, he's totally a werewolf." Harper groaned, muttering something about needing new friends. But as the day dragged on, she couldn't shake the thought. Every time she tried to dismiss it, she remembered the glow in his eyes, the way the air around him seemed to hum with power, the faint sound of a growl when he'd told her not to wander off. He didn't show up at the cafe that morning, and the absence made her restless. The bell over the door kept ringing for other people, but not him. By noon, even Mrs. Calloway asked where her forest husband had gone. Harper nearly dropped a tray at the nickname. When he finally did appear, the relief that flooded her was embarrassing. She hid it by pretending to be annoyed. He looked different, more tired, as though the world had weighed on him all night. His hair was damp again, his jacket dusted with frost, and yet he still carried that quiet steadiness like armor. "You look like you fought the weather and won," she said, trying to sound casual. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "You shouldn't go out alone at night." "There it is again," she said, raising a brow. The survival guide tone. He didn't answer, but his gaze softened in that way that made her forget every reason she'd planned to keep her distance. He lingered for coffee, fixing a loose screw on the counter before slipping away again, leaving behind the faint scent of pine and a silence that felt too full. Later that evening, Harper drove home under a sky that looked too bright for comfort. The moon was almost full, heavy and luminous. When she reached her cabin, Kellan was there, standing near the fence they'd built together. He looked conflicted, caught between leaving and staying. "You keep showing up like a stray cat," she said, stepping out of the truck. "Should I start leaving milk out?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "You shouldn't joke about things you don't understand." She leaned against the fence, pretending not to notice how close he was. "Then help me understand." He didn't answer right away. The tension between them was almost tangible, stretching thin but never breaking. She could feel something inside him coiled tight, like he was at war with himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "I wasn't supposed to stay this long," he said. "It's safer if I don't." "Safer for who?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked, and whatever he saw seemed to make the fight inside him worse. "For you." Her laughter came out softer than she intended, trying to lighten the air. "You keep saying things that sound like foreshadowing in a bad movie, you know that?" That almost smile returned, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of snow and something wild beneath it. Harper felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the strange certainty that whatever secret he carried, it was about to break open. When the first distant howl rose from the woods, Kellan's head turned sharply. The sound was deep, layered, answered by others further away. Harper froze, the sound both terrifying and oddly beautiful. "Wolves?" she whispered. He didn't reply. His breathing changed, slower, heavier, and for a fleeting second, his pupils flared gold in the moonlight. "Kellan," she said carefully, "what's happening?" He met her gaze, every word that followed thick with regret. "What you saw that night wasn't a trick of light." The truth landed between them, heavy as snow. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask again. Somehow she already knew. The forest, the way animals went still around him, his strength, his silence, it all fit together in a way she wasn't ready to believe but couldn't deny. Instead of fear, a strange calm washed over her. It made no sense. Maybe it was the shock. Or maybe it was because even now, standing before him with the night alive and wild, she still felt safe. "You're not running," he said, almost to himself. Harper crossed her arms, more to stop her hands from shaking than out of defiance. "Should I?" He looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head faintly. "No." The word came out rough, as if pulled from somewhere deep. The wind picked up again, stirring his hair, and she caught the faintest shimmer of something primal beneath his skin, a glimpse of power too ancient for the quiet man who fixed her fence and drank her coffee. Then, as quickly as it had come, the moment broke. He stepped back, jaw tight. "You should go inside." She nodded, though her mind was still spinning. As she reached the porch, she glanced back at him. He was standing in the snow, eyes on the forest, shoulders tense like he was holding back the world. Later that night, Harper sat by her window, wrapped in a blanket, watching the moon climb higher. The howls echoed again, distant yet familiar. She thought of him out there somewhere, caught between the human calm she knew and the untamed wild. She didn't. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she whispered into the quiet, "Come back." Outside, far in the dark, a single answering howl rose, low, soft, and heartbreakingly close. Chapter 9. The Truth at the Doorstep. The next morning arrived slower than usual, the kind of sleepy dawn that carried more questions than answers. Harper lay in bed, watching the thin threads of sunlight crawl across her ceiling, trying to convince herself that last night had been a dream. It would have been easier if her heartbeat didn't still race every time she replayed that moment. Kellan's eyes, gold and wild in the moonlight. The howl that had followed after she whispered for him to come back. Reality, however, had an inconvenient habit of sticking around. When she finally stumbled into the kitchen, there was evidence that she hadn't imagined it at all. Muddy footprints by the back door, faint and large enough to make her stomach twist. She stared at them in silence, torn between awe and exasperation. "Of course," she muttered. "I rescue a man, and he turns out to be part wildlife documentary." Lydia arrived minutes later, cheerful and uninvited as always, holding 2 coffees and far too much energy for a person who thrived on chaos. She took one look at Harper's face and sighed dramatically. "You saw something again, didn't you? Please tell me it wasn't him transforming into a glittery vampire. I can't handle another Twilight phase." Harper glared, but the corner of her mouth betrayed her. "He's not a vampire." Lydia grinned, sensing victory. "So you did see something. Don't tell me you're finally admitting he's a werewolf." Harper froze, unsure what to say, and that hesitation was all Lydia needed. "Oh my God, I was right," Lydia squealed, nearly spilling her coffee. "My sister is dating a werewolf. I'm buying silver cutlery immediately." "I am not dating him," Harper said, though her voice lacked conviction. She busied herself with wiping the already clean counter, hoping Lydia would mistake embarrassment for denial. Fine, Lydia said, smirking. "You're just feeding him dinner, fixing fences together, and gazing at each other like you're one emotional violin solo away from a confession. Totally platonic." Harper threw a dish towel at her. "You watch too many movies." But deep down, the words stung because they were too close to the truth. She wasn't sure what to call whatever existed between her and Kellan. It wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't normal. He was hiding half his life behind those guarded silences. Yet she couldn't stop wanting to know what he wasn't saying. By afternoon, her nerves got the best of her. The cafe felt emptier without him sitting in his usual corner, quietly existing like gravity itself. She told herself she was checking on him out of concern, but she knew better. Curiosity, affection, something unnamed. It was all tangled together. When she reached his cabin near the edge of the woods, she hesitated before knocking. The forest behind it was still, too quiet, as if even the birds were waiting for something. She raised her hand, but the door opened before she could touch it. Kellan stood there barefoot, his expression unreadable. He looked different today, tired, a little frayed at the edges, but still undeniably composed. His gaze softened when it met hers. "You shouldn't have come," he said quietly. "I'm starting to think you say that just to make me do the opposite," she replied, managing a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He sighed, the sound heavy. "There are things I haven't told you. Things that could put you in danger." Harper crossed her arms, ignoring the tremor in her chest. "Then maybe you should start telling me." For a moment he said nothing. The silence stretched between them until it felt alive. Finally, he stepped aside, letting her in. The cabin was sparse but warm, filled with the faint scent of pine and something sharper, something distinctly his. She sat on the edge of a worn armchair while he paced, as if measuring each word before he spoke. "You were right," he said finally, voice low. "I'm not human. Not entirely." She swallowed hard, her pulse loud in her ears. "You're a werewolf." His eyes flicked to hers, surprise flashing for only a second. "You don't seem shocked." Harper gave a small, uneven laugh. "When you've seen someone survive a car crash with no hospital visit, talk to the wind, and appear every time you think of them, it kind of narrows the options." He blinked, clearly not expecting humor, and for the first time that day the faintest smile tugged at his lips. "You're not afraid?" "Should I be?" "Probably," he admitted. She tilted her head. "Then I guess I'm bad at following directions." Something in his expression shifted, softening into something vulnerable and almost tender. He looked at her like she was sunlight in a place that had forgotten warmth. "You should stay away from me," he said again, though the words lacked conviction. Harper leaned back, folding her hands. "You keep saying that, but you're the one who keeps showing up in my kitchen." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt weighted with everything they weren't saying, all the glances and almost confessions that had built between them since the storm. Kellan exhaled as if giving in to something inevitable. "I didn't plan for this," he said softly. "When I met you, I was supposed to leave after one night. But my wolf—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter, you shouldn't be part of this." Harper studied him, heart aching at the quiet struggle in his voice. "You say that like I have a choice." For a long time, neither of them moved. The air between them hummed, fragile and electric. He took a step forward, and she didn't step back. His gaze flickered down to her lips, then back to her eyes. The restraint in his expression more intimate than any touch. When he finally turned away, it wasn't out of disinterest, but out of something heavier. Fear, perhaps, or longing. "You should go," he said softly. Harper hesitated, wanting to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She rose slowly, pausing at the doorway. "You can keep pretending I'm safer far away," she said. "But I think we both know I'm already too close." She left before he could respond, though she felt his gaze follow her all the way down the path. That night, Harper sat awake by her window again, listening to the wind carry the sound of distant howls through the trees. Her heart should have been racing, her mind full of fear, but instead she felt a strange, unshakable calm. Because even if the truth scared her, she wasn't going anywhere. And somewhere out in the woods, Kellan closed his eyes, his wolf whispering through his mind like a promise. "She's ours." Chapter 10. The Moon Between Us. The full moon rose like a secret she wasn't meant to know, washing the forest in silver and turning every shadow into something alive. Harper stood by her window, wrapped in a blanket and common sense that begged her not to go outside. But curiosity had long since replaced self-preservation. The quiet tug that had been pulling at her for days was stronger tonight. Something deep, instinctive, and impossible to ignore. She told herself she just needed air. That was the lie she chose as she slipped her boots on and stepped into the night. The cold bit at her cheeks, but beneath it was that strange sense of warmth she always felt when she thought of him. The world was still except for the wind moving through the trees and the faint echo of howls far away, low and mournful, a sound that sent shivers down her spine, without fear. She followed the path through the woods, guided by moonlight and something she couldn't name. The forest seemed to know her now. Branches shifted out of her way. Snow softened beneath her steps. When she reached the clearing by the stream, she saw him. Kellan stood in the moonlight, his shirt discarded, his skin shimmering with faint sweat despite the cold. His eyes caught the silver glow, and for one suspended moment she could hardly breathe. He didn't see her at first. He was moving with a tension she hadn't seen before, every muscle drawn tight like he was fighting himself. Then his head turned slightly, and his gaze locked onto hers. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice more gravel than man. "You keep saying that," she murmured, taking a step closer, "and I keep not listening." He exhaled, the sound closer to a growl than a sigh. "The moon," he stopped, jaw flexing. "It makes control harder." The way he said it wasn't a warning, it was a confession. The air between them thickened. Harper's pulse thudded in her ears, not from fear but from the sheer pull of him. Every instinct screamed to move closer, even as reason whispered she shouldn't. She took another step anyway. "Then I'll stand here quietly," she said softly. "You can do your moon thing." For a moment, something like laughter broke through his tension, low and incredulous. "You're impossible," he said, the words almost fond. "Occupational hazard," she replied, "small-town stubbornness." The flicker of amusement faded quickly as another tremor ran through him. His eyes darkened to molten gold, his breathing rough. The sound of his wolf pressed against the silence, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She should have been terrified, but instead, she felt her heartbeat steady in answer, like some invisible rhythm had aligned between them. "Harper," he rasped, his voice barely human now. "Please, go home." She shook her head slowly. "You don't scare me, Kellan." He looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his gaze changed. The gold flickered and softened, the wildness easing for just a moment. "You should," he said, though it sounded more like a prayer than a warning. The next few seconds blurred. The wind picked up swirling snow around them. Harper took one more step forward, then another, until she was close enough to see the faint shimmer of his breath in the air. She reached out without thinking. Her fingers brushed his arm. Warm, tense, alive. The spark that followed wasn't imagination. It was real, like lightning beneath her skin. Kellan froze, his jaw clenched. "You shouldn't touch me when I'm like this," he said, every word forced through restraint. "And yet," she said quietly, not moving her hand, "you haven't moved either." He closed his eyes, the struggle visible in every line of his face. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then slowly, he stepped back, the distance between them returning like a cold gust of wind. "This isn't safe," he whispered. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But neither is falling for someone who keeps fixing my fence and vanishing into the woods." His eyes opened again, and something inside them broke just slightly. "You deserve better than this," he said. She smiled faintly. "Maybe I don't want better." The words landed softly but carried more truth than either of them wanted to admit. For a moment he just stood there, snow drifting between them, silence heavy with everything unsaid. Then he turned away, exhaling like he'd been holding his breath for years. "Go home, Harper," he said again, though his voice had lost its edge. "Before I forget how to be careful." She wanted to argue, to tell him she trusted him, but she saw the tension in his shoulders and understood that he wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid for her. So she nodded, stepping back slowly, though every step felt wrong. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she looked back. He was still there, standing in the silver glow, a figure caught between man and myth. The moon framed him like a secret, and for a fleeting second, she could have sworn she saw the outline of his wolf ripple beneath his skin. She whispered into the cold air, too softly for him to hear, "I'm not going anywhere." The wind carried her words away, but somewhere behind her, a low sound echoed through the forest, a single restrained howl that spoke of longing more than wildness. Back in her cabin, Harper curled on the couch, heart still racing, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. She didn't understand it all yet, the pull, the danger, the strange calm she felt instead of fear. But she knew this much. She wasn't ready to walk away. And though she didn't know it, neither was he. Far in the woods, Kellan stood beneath the fading moon, his wolf restless, whispering through their shared thoughts. "She's not afraid of us." "She should be," he answered. But his wolf only growled softly, the sound more like approval than warning. "Then perhaps she's meant to be ours." Kellan closed his eyes, snow melting in his hair, a quiet laugh breaking through the ache in his chest. "Perhaps," he murmured to the night. "She already is." Chapter 11. The Night of Confessions. The snow had turned soft again, falling in quiet veils that covered the rooftops and muffled the usual sounds of town. Inside the cafe, the air smelled of cinnamon and roasted coffee, cozy and deceptively normal. Harper wiped down the counter for the third time that morning, though there wasn't a single crumb left in sight. Her thoughts were elsewhere, circling the night she couldn't forget. The clearing, the silver light, the way Kellan had looked at her like she was both salvation and danger. Lydia was watching her like a hawk, pretending to be casual. She stirred her coffee too slowly, eyes narrowed with suspicion that was half mischief, half genuine concern. "You've been sighing dramatically every 5 minutes. You're writing a novel in your head, or you're hopelessly in love with that man." Harper didn't look up. I'm not in love. Sure, Lydia said. And I'm the reincarnation of Shakespeare. You've been walking around here like you're starring in a tragic romance. Minus the tragedy. Well, mostly minus. Harper gave a weary smile. It's complicated. Everything about him screams complicated, Lydia said. Which means you're doomed. You always fall for the emotionally unavailable ones. This one just happens to have extra fur. Harper groaned. Can we not? But Lydia grinned, entirely too pleased with herself. Fine, I'll stop teasing when you admit you like him. Harper opened her mouth to deny it again, but closed it instead. She didn't have the energy for lies today. The truth had already been clawing its way through her since the moment Kellan's secret had slipped into the open. Whatever he was, alpha, wolf, myth, he wasn't the danger her heart pretended he was. If anything, he was the calm she hadn't realized she'd been missing. By the time she locked up that evening, the sky was heavy with clouds and the scent of more snow. Her instincts told her to go home and stay warm, but her heart was already steering her truck toward the woods. She found Kellan exactly where she somehow knew he'd be. By the frozen stream, standing in the half-dark, his breath visible in the air. He didn't look surprised to see her. Maybe he'd expected this too. You shouldn't keep coming here, he said quietly, though his tone lacked conviction. You shouldn't keep pretending you don't want me to, she replied, before she could stop herself. The words hung there heavier than the winter air. He looked at her then, the faintest smile flickering and dying before it fully formed. You're braver than you should be. I've been called worse. A small sound escaped him halfway between a sigh and a laugh. It felt like progress. Harper took a few steps closer, her boots crunching against the snow. You don't have to keep warning me away, you know. I already know what you are. And I'm still here. His gaze dropped to the ground, gold barely flickering beneath the calm amber. You shouldn't be. Maybe, she said softly. But I want to be. The honesty in her own voice startled her. It seemed to startle him too. For a long moment, neither moved. The forest held its breath. Then he stepped closer, slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild thing that could vanish at the wrong sound. When I'm near you, he said quietly. My wolf doesn't stay quiet. He wants to be seen. He wants to claim. Her pulse stumbled, but she didn't look away. And what do you want? He hesitated, and then the faintest smile curved his lips. Fragile, but real. To stop pretending I don't. The silence that followed was electric. The world seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them and the snow whispering around their feet. She hadn't realized how close they were until her breath mingled with his, warm against the cold. Kellan's voice dropped low. You have no idea what you're doing to me. Harper's smile was small and tremulous. I think I might. Then the sound of branches snapping shattered the fragile stillness. Kellan's head whipped toward the forest, instincts sharp and immediate. The gold in his eyes flared. Stay behind me, he said, his tone shifting from warmth to command in an instant. Harper didn't argue. A shadow moved between the trees, a shape too big, too fast. Then another. She saw glints of eyes, red and wrong. Rogues, though she didn't yet know the word. Kellan's posture changed, his calm replaced by a silent readiness that sent chills through her. The first creature lunged from the darkness, and for a heartbeat all she saw was movement. Then Kellan was gone, replaced by something vast and breathtaking. His wolf form erupted in motion, all power and precision, fur dark as shadow, eyes burning gold. The sound of his growl filled the clearing like thunder. Harper stood frozen, awe and terror colliding in her chest. The fight was swift and brutal, but not cruel. Every movement deliberate, controlled. Within moments, the attackers fled into the trees, vanishing as quickly as they'd come. When Kellan turned back to her, his wolf paused at the edge of the clearing. He was magnificent and terrible, but his eyes, The same eyes that had watched her across countless quiet mornings held only recognition. He took a cautious step toward her, and she, trembling but steady, lifted a hand. "Hey," she whispered, the word small and trembling. "It's just me." He lowered his head, pressing his forehead briefly against her palm. The warmth of his fur seeped into her skin, grounding her in a reality she didn't fully understand, but no longer wanted to run from. Moments later, he shifted back, breath ragged, eyes human again but softer than she'd ever seen them. He looked almost shy, which would have been funny if her heart weren't still somewhere near her throat. "I told you it wasn't safe," he murmured. "You also told me not to come here," she said, still catching her breath. "I'm not great at listening." He huffed a laugh that melted into a sigh. "You're impossible." "Occupational hazard," she replied. "Comes with being human." That earned her a smile, the first genuine one she'd seen from him. It reached his eyes this time, warm and unguarded, and something inside her finally settled. They stood there in the snow, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. The truth was already between them, heavy and certain, like the moon above. Bright, constant, and far too powerful to ignore. When Harper finally turned to go, she glanced back once more. Kellan was still there, watching her with that same look that always unraveled her calm. He raised a hand in quiet farewell, and she knew this wasn't an ending. It was only the beginning of something neither of them could stop now. Back in her cabin, Harper leaned against the door and laughed softly to herself. "I'm in so much trouble," she whispered. Outside, far in the trees, a single answering howl rose, low, steady, and filled with something that sounded very much like promise. Chapter 12. The morning after the moon. Morning crept in slowly, soft and reluctant, as if the sun itself feared breaking the spell of the night before. Harper woke to a strange stillness, too quiet for comfort, too peaceful to trust. For a long moment she stayed where she was, wrapped in the warmth of her blanket, staring at the faint light pooling across her ceiling. Her mind replayed fragments of the night, the flash of gold eyes, the whisper of fur brushing her hand, the sound of Kellan's voice right before the world went silent again. She sat up, half expecting to find him outside her door, though she didn't know what she'd say if he were. A part of her wanted to pretend nothing had changed. Another part, the one that kept remembering the way he'd looked at her after the fight, knew everything had. By the time she reached the cafe, the sky had turned a pale blue-gray, the snow glittering under the timid sun. Lydia was already there, humming to herself, wearing one of her unnecessary but fabulous scarves. The moment Harper walked in, her sister looked up and froze mid-sip of her coffee. "You look weird," Lydia said, eyes narrowing. "What happened? Did he finally confess he's secretly a wolf prince or something?" Harper gave a sigh that sounded far too dramatic even to her own ears. "Not a prince," she said, pulling off her coat. "Just a wolf. Possibly a full-time complication." Lydia choked on her drink, coughing until Harper handed her a napkin. "You're serious?" she gasped. "You've actually confirmed the supernatural boyfriend theory?" "I was kidding." "Technically, we're not dating," Harper said quickly, though the defensive tone wasn't helping her case. "He's just Kellan." "Just Kellan," Lydia repeated, making finger quotes. "Sure, and I'm just psychic, because I've been predicting this for weeks." Harper pressed her lips together, trying not to smile. "You're unbearable, you know that?" "I've been told," Lydia said, leaning on the counter. "So what now? Do you two howl at the moon together? Go for romantic runs through the woods?" "Please stop talking," Harper said, laughing despite herself. The laughter helped. It always did. It grounded her, reminded her that her life still contained normal things like burnt toast, gossiping customers, and her sister's unending supply of caffeine and unsolicited advice. But somewhere behind that normalcy, a quieter rhythm beat, a sense of something new growing between her and Kellan, fragile and terrifyingly alive. He didn't come into the cafe that morning, and part of her missed him more than she wanted to admit. By the time she returned home, the sky had turned pale with late afternoon light, and she caught herself glancing at the woods more than once. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see him appear, or if she was just testing fate. She didn't have to wait long. Kellan was waiting near the fence they'd fixed together, the same spot that seemed to hold half their history already. He looked human again, though his eyes still carried that faint glimmer that made it impossible to forget what she'd seen. "You didn't stay away," he said quietly, though there was no accusation in his tone. "You didn't either," she replied, stepping closer. He gave a small nod, as if accepting the truth in that. "I thought it would scare you." "It did," she admitted, meeting his gaze, "and just not enough." The corners of his mouth curved into something that almost became a smile. "You should be more cautious." "I've been cautious my whole life," she said softly. "It's exhausting." The simple honesty of it made him look away, jaw tightening, as if he didn't know what to do with her lack of fear. When his eyes found hers again, they were softer, full of things he wasn't ready to say. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "You saw what happens when I lose control." "And I saw you fight to keep it," she countered. "You protected me, Kellan. You always do." Something shifted in his expression, like a wall cracking just enough to let the light in. "You shouldn't trust me so easily," he murmured. "Maybe I should stop telling myself not to," she said. "Because somehow I already do." He exhaled slowly, a sound that almost resembled surrender. The silence between them felt less like distance now and more like a language neither of them had quite learned yet. She moved closer, stopping just a step away. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, the smell of pine and winter, the sound of her heartbeat, the way his gaze traced her face as though memorizing it. "You keep saying I shouldn't be here," she whispered. "Then tell me to go." He didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he reached up, hesitating before brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was light but grounding, warm enough to send 1,000 small shivers through her. "You're stubborn," he said finally, the faintest trace of humor in his voice. "Occupational hazard," she murmured back, smiling. He huffed a quiet laugh, the kind that sounded like he hadn't done it in a long time. The tension broke, replaced by a gentler stillness. For the first time since she'd met him, he looked at ease. Human, despite everything he wasn't. They stayed there until the cold began to nip at her fingers. When she finally turned toward the cabin, he didn't stop her, but she could feel his gaze following her every step of the way. At her door, she glanced back and found him still standing by the fence, his breath misting in the fading light. He gave a small nod, the kind of quiet promise that didn't need words. Later that night, Harper sat curled up with a book she didn't read a single word of. Every few minutes, she'd glance out the window toward the trees, and every time she'd tell herself she was just checking the weather. But deep down, she knew the truth. Somewhere out there, he was watching over her, the same way he always did. And for once, that thought didn't scare her, it warmed her, it made her smile. Because somehow, between the secrets and the silences, between the fear and the moonlight, they'd found something almost ordinary, something that felt dangerously close to love. Chapter 13. The Edge of Belonging. The next morning, the air smelled faintly of thawing snow and roasted coffee beans. Harper unlocked the cafe and let herself sink into the comfort of routine. The scrape of chairs against wood, the hum of the old espresso machine, the faint chatter of early customers. It grounded her, but beneath it all, the steady rhythm of her heart refused to calm. It had been only a day since the full moon, and yet something in her world had quietly, irreversibly shifted. She had seen Kellan's other half, the wolf beneath the calm, the power behind the silence. And instead of fear, she felt only the strange ache of recognition. The memory lingered in every breath, as though some invisible thread now connected them. By mid-morning, Lydia waltzed in wearing sunglasses too large for winter and carrying a box of muffins she'd claimed to have bought to distract from emotional chaos. She plopped the box down on the counter with all the ceremony of an announcement. "So," she began. Have you and the wolfman picked out wedding colors yet? Or are you still in the denial stage? Harper groaned softly. It's too early for this. Early? It's practically lunchtime, Lydia said, pulling a muffin apart like a gossiping oracle. And don't deflect. You're glowing. Either you're secretly engaged, or he told you his tragic backstory, and you melted faster than snow on asphalt. Harper rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. Lydia didn't need confirmation. She could see it. There was something gentler in Harper now, an ease that hadn't been there before. He's complicated, Harper admitted finally, lowering her voice. And I don't even know what this is. It's not normal. Normal's overrated, Lydia said. So is sanity apparently, since you're dating a werewolf. We're not, Harper began, but Lydia held up a hand. Save it, you can't lie to me. I've seen the way you look at him. You're like a girl in a Hallmark movie who accidentally fell for a Christmas tree farmer, except your guy turns into a majestic killing machine once a month. Harper tried not to laugh but failed, the sound escaping her in a small, helpless burst. You're ridiculous. And you're smitten, Lydia replied, smiling triumphantly. It's fine. You've earned some drama in your love life. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers and laughter, but beneath it all, anticipation coiled quietly. Kellan hadn't been in town since the night of the fight, and though she told herself not to expect him, she couldn't help glancing at the door every time the bell rang. He arrived just after closing, when the cafe lights had dimmed to gold and the scent of coffee lingered like a whisper. Harper was wiping down the counter when she heard the door creak open. She didn't need to look to know it was him. The air seemed to shift when he entered, subtle and magnetic. You're late, she said without turning, her voice softer than she meant it to be. I wasn't sure if I should come, he admitted. Well, you did, she said, glancing up. So now you have to at least pretend to enjoy small talk. Something like amusement flickered across his face. He moved closer, hesitant but sure, as if every step toward her carried weight. Small talk isn't my strength, he said. It's fine, she replied. You can brood quietly. I'll handle the conversation. He exhaled, half sigh, half laugh, and leaned against the counter. You make everything sound easier than it is. That's my superpower, she said, drying her hands, that and pretending I'm not terrified half the time. His eyes softened. Of me? She hesitated, then shook her head. No. Of what this is. The silence that followed was delicate, the kind that could break under the wrong word. He looked at her for a long moment, and then very quietly said, You shouldn't have to be afraid. I'm not, she said truthfully. That's the problem. He blinked, caught off guard, and she smiled, a small thing that felt like a victory. You've ruined my ability to feel normal about anything, she continued lightly. Now every other man I meet is going to seem terribly boring. I'll try to feel guilty about that, he murmured, but the corner of his mouth curved. She stepped closer, closing the space between them until she could smell the faint trace of forest and rain that always clung to him. Don't, she said softly. I like complicated. For a heartbeat, neither moved. His eyes dropped to her lips, then flickered away, restraint drawn like a bowstring. Harper, he said quietly, I don't want to hurt you. You won't, she replied, the certainty in her voice surprising even her. You'd rather drive yourself insane than risk it. He let out a low laugh, and it was the most human sound she'd ever heard from him. You know me too well already. I'm observant, she said, a little breathless. Something unspoken passed between them, the kind of moment that tilted the world slightly. He reached out, his fingers grazing her hand, tentative and warm. She didn't pull away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. You shouldn't have to belong to a world like mine. Maybe I don't, she said, but you do, and I want to know it. He looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly, as if conceding to a truth he couldn't avoid. Then I'll show you, he said softly. Her smile was small but certain. Tomorrow? He inclined his head. Tomorrow. As he turned to leave, Harper leaned against the counter, her pulse still unsteady but her heart oddly calm. Lydia would have called it lunacy, and maybe she was right. But for the first time in a long time, Harper didn't care. Outside, the night was crisp and quiet. Through the window, she watched Kellan disappear into the woods, his figure fading into the darkness like a promise. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this much. Whatever it was, she'd face it, head on, sarcasm, and all. Because falling for him wasn't a mistake. It was the first thing that had ever truly felt like belonging. And as the moon rose over Ashbourne, silver and whole again, Harper smiled to herself, whispering into the stillness, so much for normal. Chapter 14. The Invitation to the Pack. The next morning arrived, dressed in gold, the kind of light that made the world look like it had just remembered how to breathe. Harper woke earlier than usual, nerves buzzing like static. Kellan's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "I'll show you." It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was anticipation, threaded with the thrill of something unknown. She brewed coffee twice as strong as usual, telling herself she'd need the energy. Lydia noticed the over-preparation immediately when she arrived to help open the cafe. 3 cups before 8 a.m.? Either you're plotting a murder or a date, she said, rummaging through the pastry shelf like a detective. "It's not a date," Harper replied, trying to sound casual. "It's more of a cultural exchange." Lydia arched an eyebrow. "Between humans and wolves?" "Sure, sounds totally normal." "Should I bring silver jewelry just in case?" Harper shot her a look, but the smile tugging at her lips betrayed her. "You're impossible." "Runs in the family," Lydia said cheerfully. By late afternoon, Harper found herself pacing near the cafe door, checking her reflection in the window every few minutes. She'd dressed simply, jeans, boots, and her warmest coat. But it felt like preparing for an adventure she couldn't name. When Kellan appeared at the edge of the street, his presence sent her pulse tripping over itself. He looked effortlessly composed, as always, the wind catching his hair just enough to make him look carved from the very woods he ruled. "You're nervous," he said when he reached her, his tone softer than his words. "Should I be?" she asked. "Maybe," he admitted, then smiled faintly. "But I'll be there." It wasn't reassurance in words. It was in the way he said it, steady and sure. She followed him toward the forest, the sun dipping low behind them. The walk was quiet, filled with the hush of snow and the faint rustle of branches overhead. Every now and then, she'd glance at him, and each time he'd catch her looking, the corners of his mouth would twitch in that subtle, almost smile that had started to undo her entirely. When the trees opened into a clearing, she stopped short. There were others there, figures moving between the trees, shapes shifting easily from shadow to light. People. Wolves. Both. Harper's breath caught as she realized she was standing at the edge of Kellan's world. "This is my pack," he said quietly, as if afraid to break the fragile awe that held her still. They turned to look at her, eyes gleaming with curiosity, suspicion, and something else. Acceptance, perhaps, hidden beneath instinct. A tall woman with short, dark hair stepped forward first, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "So, this is the human," she said. "Brave or foolish, can't tell which." "Both," Kellan said simply, and somehow that made Harper laugh. The sound earned her a few surprised looks, but the tension around the clearing eased. Introductions followed. Milo, Kellan's second-in-command, who greeted her with a grin that bordered on mischief. Lena, the healer, whose voice carried calm authority, and a handful of others whose names blurred together in Harper's overwhelmed mind. They spoke with the ease of family, teasing one another, moving in quiet synchronicity that spoke of years bound by something stronger than blood. Harper felt out of place at first, awkward and very human, but Kellan never left her side. Every glance from him, every small reassurance, a nod, a touch on her arm, tethered her back to calm. Dinner happened around a fire, though. Dinner was generous. It was more like a gathering filled with laughter, stories, and enough warmth to chase away the cold. Harper found herself smiling more than she expected. Milo told her about his first disastrous attempt at cooking. "You can't burn water, but I found a way," while Lena lectured Kellan about his apparent inability to relax. It was strange, and yet it wasn't. These people, these wolves, didn't feel monstrous or alien. They felt alive, real. A little wild, yes, but full of the same humor and stubbornness that made Harper herself human. At one point, Lydia's voice echoed in her mind. "You're either brave or insane." She suspected the line between the two had blurred long ago. As the night deepened, Kellan led her a little away from the group, to where the firelight met the shadows. The moon had risen again, soft and silver, filtering through the branches. "You fit here," he said, watching her more than the fire. "I don't," she said with a small laugh. "But it's nice to pretend I do." "You don't have to pretend," he murmured. She looked at him, the flicker of firelight painting his face in gold and shadow. "They don't mind me?" "They'll protect you," he said simply, "because I do." The honesty in that made her breath catch. There was no poetry, no performance, just truth. She reached out instinctively, brushing his sleeve. "You say things like that and then expect me not to fall harder," she said, her voice half a whisper, half a joke to keep her heart steady. He smiled faintly. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," she replied, holding his gaze. "But it's worth it." Something softened in his eyes, something unguarded that made the space between them shrink until even the air seemed to pause. His hand rose, brushing against her cheek, a gesture so light it felt imagined. "You shouldn't be here," he said again, though his voice carried no conviction. "I keep hearing that," she whispered, leaning into the warmth of his touch. "And yet you stay." "And yet I stay," she said, smiling. They stood there, neither moving, the night quiet except for the crackle of fire and distant laughter from the pack. Somewhere, a wolf howled, long and low, its sound folding into the silence like a hymn. Harper thought it might have been the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard. By the time they walked back toward town, the snow had started falling again. Kellan matched her pace, his hand brushing hers once, twice, until she gave up pretending it was accidental. Their fingers laced together, tentative at first, then sure. When they reached the edge of the trees, she looked back at the faint glow of firelight still flickering through the pines. "Your world's not what I expected," she said softly. "No," he replied, glancing at her. "Neither are you." Her laugh was quiet, warm against the cold. "Guess we're even then." As she turned toward home, the wind carried a faint sound from the forest, a chorus of wolves, steady and proud, echoing beneath the rising moon. For the first time, Harper didn't flinch. She smiled, realizing that what she'd once feared had become part of something she wanted to protect. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. She wasn't standing on the outside anymore. For better or worse, she was already halfway in. Chapter 15. The Weight of the Heart. The days that followed Harper's visit to the pack carried a kind of quiet wonder, the kind that made even the simplest moments feel charged with meaning. She found herself thinking about that night, the laughter, the warmth, the easy way the wolves had moved between human and something more. They hadn't been monsters or stories. They'd been people, alive in a way that made her own heart feel sharper, fuller. Still, reality had a way of creeping back in. The next morning, Harper was sweeping snow from the cafe steps when Lydia appeared, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky and holding a pastry box like a weapon. "I heard you went to meet his pack," she said, voice thick with both horror and fascination. "Please tell me you didn't join a cult." Harper leaned on the broom. "It's not a cult, it's a family. A very large, occasionally furry family." Lydia blinked. "You say that like it's a reasonable sentence." "I'm adjusting," Harper replied. Clearly, Lydia said. Next thing I know, you'll be howling at the moon and signing up for loyalty programs that involve raw meat. Despite herself, Harper laughed. You're insufferable. And you're glowing again, Lydia countered, narrowing her eyes. Did something happen between you two? And don't say no, because you've been humming since I walked in, and you only hum when you're smitten or caffeinated. Harper tried to look offended but gave up quickly. Nothing happened, she said, then hesitated. Well, something happened. Just not the thing you're implying. Lydia made a knowing sound, the one that usually preceded unfiltered commentary. You're doomed. He's the brooding type. Next thing you know, you'll be living in a cabin making soup for a pack of emotionally constipated werewolves. Harper's laugh broke free before she could stop it, and for a moment the cafe filled with it, warm and bright. She didn't deny the image, though. Part of her, some quiet, unashamed part, didn't hate it. Later that afternoon, when the lunch rush died and the snow began to fall again, Harper found herself glancing out the window. And there he was, Kellan, standing across the street, looking impossibly out of place amid the small-town simplicity. He didn't have to call her. She could feel him there, as though some part of her had begun to tune itself to his presence. When she stepped outside, the cold hit her cheeks, but the sight of him warmed her more than she cared to admit. You keep showing up like a stray, she said, her tone light. You know I might start feeding you. He smiled faintly. Maybe I was hoping you would. It was such a simple exchange, but it made her pulse stumble anyway. He glanced past her toward the cafe window where Lydia was watching unabashedly, waving with a grin that promised interrogation later. Harper groaned softly. She's unbearable. She cares, Kellan said, though his mouth curved in amusement. She's going to think we're... Harper stopped herself, realizing the rest of the sentence was too close to the truth. Never mind. He tilted his head slightly. Think we're what? She shook her head. You're enjoying this way too much. I rarely enjoy anything, he admitted, his voice calm. But I do enjoy you. The words landed like warmth spreading through her veins. It wasn't flirtation. It was honesty, spoken in the quiet way only he could manage. She looked at him, momentarily unable to form a clever response. Instead, she just said softly, That's unfair. I've been told, he replied. They walked together through the streets, snow crunching underfoot. The town felt smaller beside him, as if the rest of the world dimmed when he was near. Every once in a while, he'd say something quietly, about the way his pack worked, about the forest's boundaries, about things he wanted her to understand. His words were thoughtful, his silences even more so. When they reached the edge of town where the road met the woods, he stopped. I shouldn't bring you here too often, he said, eyes scanning the horizon. You draw attention. Because I'm human. Because you're mine, he said, then froze as though realizing what he'd just admitted. The words hung in the cold air, visible like breath. Harper's heart skipped, half a beat behind her thoughts. Yours? She repeated, voice soft. He looked at her, eyes flickering between caution and truth. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said finally. But the bond, my wolf recognizes it. You. It's not something I can control. She should have been afraid, or at least cautious, but all she felt was an odd stillness, as if everything had just clicked into place. And what about you? She asked. Do you recognize it? Kellan's voice dropped low. Every time you look at me. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Harper could feel the weight of what he hadn't said, the fear, the longing, the impossibility of it all. And yet, standing there in the quiet, she realized she wasn't scared. Not anymore. You can't ask me to stay away, she said softly. I wasn't going to. Something inside her loosened at that, laughter bubbling up unexpectedly. You're terrible at being the brooding, mysterious type, you know. You keep ruining your own drama with honesty. His expression softened into something that almost looked like a grin. "You're not what I expected either." "Good," she said. "You look like a man who needed to be surprised." He shook his head slightly, the ghost of amusement still there. "You're infuriating." "So I've been told," she said, echoing his tone. The banter faded into comfortable silence. He reached for her hand then, tentative but certain, and she let him. Their fingers fit together like they'd done this 100 times before. When they walked back toward the cafe, the snow fell heavier, covering their footprints as they went. Harper glanced at him once, catching the faintest smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth, and for the first time, she saw what peace looked like on him. Lydia was waiting at the door when they returned, her expression smug enough to make Harper groan. "You two look like the end of a romantic movie," she announced. "If you start slow dancing in the snow, I'm charging admission." Harper shot her a glare. "Don't you have somewhere to be?" "Nowhere nearly as entertaining as this," Lydia said, sipping her coffee. Kellan merely raised a brow. "She's spirited." "That's one word for it," Harper muttered. Lydia winked. "You're welcome for the free character reference." Kellan gave a quiet laugh, low, brief but real, and the sound made Harper's chest tighten in the best possible way. She'd never get used to that sound, the way it made the air seem lighter. When he finally left that evening, promising to return soon, Harper stood by the window, watching him disappear into the snow. Lydia sidled up beside her, smug but softer now. "You really like him?" she said quietly. Harper didn't answer right away. She watched the last trace of his figure fade into the forest and smiled to herself. "Yeah," she said finally. "I really do." And as the snow fell heavier, blanketing the quiet streets, Harper realized that the weight in her chest wasn't fear anymore. It was love, still forming, still fragile, but growing stronger with every passing heartbeat. It felt terrifying, it felt perfect. Chapter 16. The Heart of Winter. Snow fell thicker than usual that morning, veiling the town in a hush that made every sound seem sacred. Harper stood by her cafe window, watching the white swirl around lampposts and rooftops. The world looked softer, as though it had been repainted overnight. She should have been worried about shoveling the walkway or whether deliveries would arrive, but her thoughts were somewhere else entirely. In the woods. With him. It had been 3 days since Kellan last visited. 3 long, silent days that stretched like unanswered questions. She told herself he was busy with his pack or avoiding town until the storm passed, but part of her wondered if the night he'd called her mine had been too much for him. The memory lived behind her ribs, flickering between joy and ache. Lydia showed up an hour later in full dramatic mode, cheeks flushed from the cold, scarf wound 3 times around her neck, and the energy of someone who thrived on emotional chaos. "You've been staring out that window like a widow in a Gothic novel," she announced. "If you start writing tragic poetry, I'm staging an intervention." Harper gave her a look that didn't hold much conviction. "I'm fine." Lydia snorted. "That's what people say right before they start feeding stray wolves and calling it therapy." Harper couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "He's not a stray." "Right," Lydia said, grabbing a muffin. "He's an emotionally unavailable mythological being. Much better." Harper swatted at her, but the humor eased something in her chest. It always did. Lydia might drive her insane, but she was the only person who could turn heartbreak into comedy with one well-placed jab. The bell over the door chimed later that afternoon, and Harper's breath caught before she even turned. Kellan stood there, dusted in snow, hair damp and eyes bright against the gray light. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her as if he were trying to remember how to start. "You look half frozen," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Had to make sure the roads were safe for town," he said. His tone was casual, but his gaze wasn't. It lingered, warm and searching, and something in her eased at last. Lydia took one look at them and decided to leave with suspicious speed. "I'll, go check on inventory," she said, practically sprinting toward the back room. Harper crossed her arms. "You don't even know what inventory means." "Don't ruin this for me," came the distant reply. Kellan's lips twitched. "She's subtle." "She thinks she is," Harper said, smiling despite herself. He moved closer, slow and deliberate, his usual calm shadowed by something heavier, regret maybe, or hesitation. "I should have come sooner," he said quietly. "You're here now," she said. "That's enough." For a moment neither spoke. The cafe around them felt smaller somehow, like the world had folded in to make space for just the two of them. Outside, snow pressed against the glass, muffling the sounds of town life until there was only the faint hum of the heater and the rhythm of their breathing. "I didn't mean to stay away," he said at last. "The pack needed me. There's been tension since the rogues came near the border. They think—" He paused, jaw tightening. "They think having you close makes me distracted." Harper raised an eyebrow. "And are they wrong?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No." The honesty of it hit her harder than any confession. She took a slow breath, stepping around the counter until she stood near him. "You're terrible at lying," she said softly. "It's one of your better qualities." He smiled then, faint and fleeting but real. "You make it sound like a flaw." "It's a relief," she said. "I've had enough mysteries for one lifetime." The air between them shifted, warmth curling through the quiet. His hand brushed against hers, tentative at first, then steadier when she didn't pull away. "You've changed everything," he murmured. "Funny," she said. "I was about to say the same thing." For a long moment they just stood there, two people suspended between humor and gravity, between what they were and what they were becoming. His thumb traced small, absent circles against her knuckles, and it was such a simple thing, yet it made her pulse skip. Then, because Harper couldn't resist the urge to break tension when it got too heavy, she smiled and said, "You know, Lydia thinks I'm going to start baking treats for wolves. She said I'll be the next Martha Stewart of the supernatural world." Kellan's laugh startled them both. It was low and unguarded, the kind of sound that wrapped around her and settled deep. "If she's right," he said, "I'll make sure the pack supports your new business venture." "You'd eat muffins?" she asked, feigning disbelief. "Only if they were yours." She blinked, the smile that followed slower, softer. That was dangerously close to flirting. "I'm learning," he said. Snow fell harder outside, blurring the world into white. They watched it for a while, standing shoulder to shoulder. Harper felt something inside her steady, a strange peace wrapped in warmth and laughter. When Lydia finally re-emerged, carrying an empty tray as though she'd been doing something useful, she froze at the sight of their joined hands. "Oh," she said, grinning. "I see I missed the Hallmark finale. Should I start planning the wedding or the apocalypse?" Harper groaned. "Lydia, please." Kellan's mouth curved slightly. "She's relentless." "She's family," Harper said, which makes her my personal punishment. Lydia pointed at them dramatically. "You're both nauseatingly cute. I hate it. Continue." Kellan gave Harper a look that almost resembled amusement. "You're braver than I thought," he said quietly, once Lydia vanished again. "Or more patient," Harper replied. "Depends on the day." He leaned closer, voice dropping. "I think it's both." The world outside had dimmed by the time he left, the cafe aglow with warm light and laughter still lingering in the air. Harper stood by the door long after it closed behind him, tracing the edge of her sleeve where his hand had brushed against hers. The ache she used to feel when he was gone had changed now. It was quieter, softer, something closer to hope than longing. Lydia reappeared, her smirk far too knowing. "So," she said, "is he officially your wolfman now? Or do we need to draft a treaty between species first?" Harper rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the smile tugging at her lips. "Go home, Lydia." "I live for this," her sister said, grabbing her coat. "But fine. Just don't let him turn you into a werewolf. I don't have enough silver jewelry for that." When Harper finally locked up and stepped outside, The night met her like an embrace, cold, clear, and full of stars. The snow glittered beneath the lamplight, untouched and perfect. Somewhere deep in the woods she heard a distant howl, steady, strong, and strangely familiar. She smiled, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I'll take that as a good night," she murmured and turned toward home, the sound following her like a promise. Chapter 17. The Whisper of the Bond. The winter sun struggled to rise that morning, its light pale and uncertain, spilling across the rooftops of Ashbourne like a secret too shy to be told. Harper stood in front of the cafe with her hands wrapped around a steaming cup, watching flakes of frost melt on the window pane. The cold had settled into everything, her breath, her bones, the quiet stretch of sky above. Yet beneath all that stillness, she felt it again, that quiet, persistent hum beneath her skin, the one that told her Kellan was somewhere near. Since the night he had confessed about the bond, her world had taken on a strange new rhythm. She could feel him in moments she couldn't explain, in the way her heartbeat steadied for no reason, or how the silence of the woods behind her cabin sometimes seemed to breathe. It wasn't frightening anymore, it was grounding like a thread that tied her to something beyond understanding. The door opened behind her with the familiar jingle of the cafe bell, and Lydia swept in, wrapped in her usual chaos of scarves and sass. "You're outside staring at nothing again," she said. "Either you've joined a meditation cult or you're waiting for the world's most brooding boyfriend to materialize out of mist." Harper smiled faintly, refusing to take the bait. "You're very dramatic for someone who's allergic to mornings." "Someone has to provide the entertainment," Lydia said, kicking snow from her boots. "So how's the supernatural romance going? Have you started howling yet, or are you still at the longing glances stage?" Harper laughed quietly and shook her head. "You're incorrigible." Lydia leaned across the counter, lowering her voice like a conspirator. "You love it. You can't fool me. Every time I mention his name, you glow like a fireplace." Harper didn't respond right away. She only smiled into her cup, letting the warmth rise to her cheeks. Lydia noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But for once she let it go, perhaps sensing that teasing would only make her sister retreat. The morning passed slowly, filled with the steady comfort of brewing coffee and clinking cups. Yet even with customers coming and going, Harper's thoughts wandered. The memory of Kellan's voice still lingered in her mind, low and rough, when he had said she was his. She should have been terrified by the weight of that word. Instead, she found herself wanting to hear it again. By the time the sky began to dim, she felt that subtle pull again, like gravity had shifted toward the woods. She didn't even need to turn when the bell above the cafe door chimed. She already knew it was him. Kellan stood there dusted with snow, his coat unbuttoned, eyes reflecting the low, amber light of the room. He didn't say anything at first, but something about his presence filled the air, as though every breath around him deepened. "You're late," Harper said softly, hiding her relief behind a faint smile. "I came as soon as I could," he replied, voice calm, but weighted. Lydia, sitting at the far table with her notebook, grinned like a fox. "Ah, the alpha returns," she said, standing to leave. "I'll give you 2 privacy before my mere humanity ruins the mood." "Don't eavesdrop, Harper warned. "I'd never," Lydia said, already halfway to the door. "Text me if you get engaged." When the door shut behind her, silence returned, comfortable but charged. Harper gestured toward the counter. "Coffee?" He shook his head. "I didn't come for coffee." Something in his tone made her heartbeat quicken. She turned to face him fully. "Then why did you come?" He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Because the bond doesn't quiet when I stay away," he said. "It only grows stronger." She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't that. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "And what exactly does that mean?" His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "It means that I feel you even when you're not near. It's not just my wolf, it's me. You've become a part of what steadies him, of what steadies me." The words stole her breath. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, but she felt the truth in every syllable. It was terrifying and beautiful all at once. "Kellan," she began, but her voice faltered. He reached out, resting his hand over hers. His touch was warm, almost feverishly so, and the moment his skin met hers, something deep inside her chest stirred. A faint hum, a vibration that wasn't entirely her own heartbeat. For a second the world tilted and she could almost feel his emotions brushing against hers. A flicker of warmth, of restraint, of something wild trying desperately to stay gentle. Her breath caught. "What was that?" "The bond," he said quietly. "You felt it?" She nodded slowly, not trusting herself to speak. The sensation faded, leaving a lingering warmth, a quiet echo in her veins. It wasn't frightening. It was intimate, deeper than words. For a long moment they stood like that, the sound of the wind outside wrapping around the cafe walls. Then Harper broke the silence with a soft, nervous laugh. "You know, Lydia's going to lose her mind when I tell her about this." Kellan's mouth curved, the faintest hint of amusement returning to his face. "Maybe don't tell her everything." "I won't," she said, smiling now. "But she'll guess. She always does." He shook his head, though his eyes glimmered with warmth. "You make this all seem easier than it is." "Maybe that's what I'm good at," she said, "finding the light parts in heavy things." His thumb brushed her hand once, a gesture so small yet so deliberate, it sent another quiet tremor through her chest. "You are the light part," he said softly. Harper blinked, startled by the simplicity of it. "You're going to ruin my ability to be cynical," she murmured, smiling despite the lump in her throat. "Good," he said, and his voice carried a kind of peace she hadn't heard before. Outside, the wind softened, the snow easing into a gentle drift. The world beyond the windows blurred into white and gold, and for a few quiet minutes, it felt like time had stopped. When he finally left, she stood by the door, watching him walk into the fading light. He didn't look back, but she didn't need him to. She could feel him instead, the faint pulse of warmth just beneath her skin, steady and sure. Lydia returned moments later, face flushed from the cold and grin ready-made. "So," she said, taking in Harper's expression, "am I planning a wedding or a pack initiation?" Harper laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "Impossible, but right," Lydia said, winking. Maybe she was, because as Harper stood there, her laughter fading into a quiet smile, she could still feel it, the whisper of him inside her chest, the faint echo of something ancient and alive. It wasn't just a bond anymore. It was belonging. And for the first time in her life, belonging didn't scare her at all. Chapter 18. When Wolves Dream. The moon rose pale and round above Ashbourne that evening, silvering the rooftops and stretching long shadows across the snow. The town had gone quiet early, as if the cold itself demanded stillness. Harper lingered in her cabin by the window, wrapped in an old knit blanket, half reading a book she hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. Her thoughts drifted as easily as the wind beyond the glass. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, Kellan at the cafe door, Kellan walking through the trees, Kellan's expression when he told her she steadied the wild inside him. The bond had become something she couldn't quite define. She felt him even now, a faint pulse that lived somewhere beneath her ribs. It wasn't intrusive, it was a quiet reassurance, like a heartbeat not her own reminding her she wasn't alone. A soft knock startled her from her thoughts. She rose, heart quickening before logic could catch up. When she opened the door, there he was, snow caught in his dark hair, breath misting in the chill. He looked every bit like a man carved out of the winter itself. "You should be asleep," he said, his tone gentle, though his eyes betrayed something warmer. "I could say the same about you," she answered, stepping aside to let him in. The fire was low, casting gold across the wooden floor, and he moved toward it without a word, shaking snow from his coat. For a few moments neither spoke. The silence between them had grown comfortable now, no longer fragile but alive in its own way. Harper watched him from the corner of her eye, the way the light curved along his shoulders, the small things about him that shouldn't have mattered, but somehow did. "You look tired," she said at last. "Dreams," he admitted quietly. "They've been restless lately." "Bad ones?" "Not bad," he said. "Just loud." He sat by the fire, and she joined him, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Do wolves dream?" she asked after a moment, her voice softer than she intended. He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Of course. We dream of running, of the hunt, of snow and silence. Sometimes of memories that don't belong to the human half." "And what about you?" she asked. "What do you dream of?" His gaze lingered on the flames. "Lately of peace," he said. Then more quietly, "Of you." The words hung in the air, neither heavy nor light, just true. Harper's heart stumbled. She wanted to look away but couldn't. Something in his tone, the way he said it without hesitation or ceremony, stripped her of every practiced defense. "You should stop saying things like that," she murmured, trying to sound teasing. "You're making it very hard for me to stay rational." He turned his head slightly, and the flicker of amusement in his eyes softened into something deeper. "I don't think either of us has been rational for a while." She laughed under her breath, low and warm. "That's fair." Outside, the wind swept against the windows, but the fire held steady, filling the space with quiet heat. They sat close now, close enough for their shoulders to brush when she leaned forward to add another log. When he reached to steady the fire iron for her, their hands touched, a small spark jumping between them. Neither of them pulled away. Harper looked at their joined hands, the contrast of skin and strength, and said softly, "This bond thing, can you always feel it?" "Yes," he said. "Even when I try not to. It's like hearing a distant sound that never fades." "Is that annoying?" she asked, smiling faintly. "It's grounding," he replied, "like knowing where home is." Her breath caught at that, and she wasn't sure what to do with the quiet that followed. She could still feel the pulse of warmth where their hands met, could feel her heartbeat racing a little too fast. So she did what she always did when emotion grew too large. She leaned into humor, light and steady. "So," she said, "if I stub my toe, do you feel it too? Because that might be a deal breaker." He laughed, the sound low and genuine. "Only the important things," he said. "Good," she replied. "I'd hate for you to suffer every time I trip over a coffee table." The laughter faded, but the warmth lingered. When she finally looked up at him, he was watching her with that same quiet intensity that had undone her since the day they met. "You make this easier," he said softly. "Falling for me?" she teased, though her voice trembled a little on the last word. He smiled faintly, being human. That silenced her. For all his strength, for all the mythic weight he carried, he said it with a vulnerability that cracked something open in her chest. She didn't respond, didn't need to. She only reached up and brushed her fingers lightly against his jaw, tracing the line of it like she was memorizing something fragile. He leaned into her touch without a word. The silence between them was full, of things unsaid, of everything that didn't need saying. When he finally stood, the fire had burned low, the cabin steeped in the soft light of embers. "You should sleep," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, rising slowly, reluctant to let the moment end. "Will you be all right?" He smiled, small, real, and enough. "I always am when you're near." He opened the door, the cold rushing in around them, and for a second she almost asked him to stay. But he didn't need to hear it. Something in her chest told her he already knew. After he left, Harper stood by the window again, watching his figure disappear into the trees. The snow had started falling again, soft and relentless. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, the sound long and low and unmistakably his. It wasn't a call of loneliness. It was something else entirely. something that reached her heart and settled there like a promise. She smiled to herself, pulling the blanket tighter, her breath misting the cold glass. "Good night, Kellan," she whispered, knowing he would somehow hear it. And out in the woods under the rising moon he did. Chapter 19. The Moon's Confession. The morning after the snowfall was clear and quiet, the kind of calm that makes even small towns feel suspended between heartbeats. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the world seemed to glow faintly under the pale light. Harper stood by the cafe window before opening, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The warmth she felt wasn't from the drink. It came from the memory of the night before. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him again. Kellan by the fire, his voice low and unguarded, the echo of his laugh lingering in her mind. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, the steady pulse of something that wasn't quite hers alone. The bond hummed faintly even now, like a secret heartbeat that belonged to both of them. When Lydia arrived late as usual, she barely got her gloves off before launching into interrogation mode. "You look like someone who's been kissed by destiny," she said, narrowing her eyes. "Or possibly just kissed, period." Harper sighed, setting down her cup. "It was just a conversation." "With him?" "Yes." "Then it wasn't just a conversation," Lydia said, smirking. "Don't bother lying. You've got that faraway look, the same one you used to get when you thought about chocolate cake." Harper laughed softly, shaking her head. "You're impossible." "And you're predictable," Lydia said. "So? What did your mysterious forest boyfriend do this time? Did he declare eternal devotion under the moon? Growl something poetic? I need details, Harper. The public demands them." Harper tried not to smile, but it was useless. He talked about dreams. "Dreams," Lydia repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's either deeply romantic or a sign that you're both repressing your feelings in increasingly creative ways." It was... Harper paused, struggling to find the words. It was real, quiet, like nothing else existed for a little while. Lydia's teasing faded, replaced by a softer expression. "You're in deep, huh?" Harper smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." "Good," Lydia said, nodding decisively. "You deserve someone who looks at you like you hung the moon. And I mean that literally, since he probably howls at it." "Lydia," Harper said, trying not to laugh. "What?" "I'm being supportive," her sister replied, completely unrepentant. The day unfolded in its usual rhythm, customers coming in for coffee, laughter echoing against the walls. But Harper moved through it as if the air around her had changed. She caught herself glancing toward the door too often, waiting for the familiar sound of the bell that marked his arrival. By late afternoon, when he still hadn't appeared, she told herself to stop watching, to focus on something else. But she didn't have to wait much longer. When the door opened just as she was closing up, she didn't even need to look. The quiet in her chest shifted, and the bond stirred like a whisper. Kellan stood in the doorway, his coat dusted with snow, his expression unreadable but soft around the edges. "You're late," she said lightly, her smile betraying her relief. "There were things to handle," he replied. "The pack needed me, but I wanted to see you." The simplicity of the words made something inside her melt. She tried to hide it behind sarcasm. "You're getting better at this whole romance thing." He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning from you." She busied herself stacking chairs, pretending not to notice the way he watched her. The silence between them stretched comfortably, full of unsaid thoughts that no longer needed to be hidden. When she turned back, he was closer, standing near the counter with his hands resting loosely in his pockets. "The pack has accepted you," he said quietly. "They trust you now." She blinked in surprise. "Really? Even the one who glared at me like I was a walking steak?" "That's Milo," he said, a hint of amusement flickering in his tone. "He glares at everyone. It's a hobby." Harper grinned. "Good to know I'm not special in that department." "You're special," he said without hesitation, the words slipping out too naturally to be casual. Her breath caught, and for a moment she couldn't look away. You say things like that so easily. It's only easy when it's true. The quiet that followed was delicate, the air between them humming with something that felt both heavy and weightless. She wanted to look away, but his gaze anchored her. You shouldn't keep doing this, she said softly. Saying things that make it harder to breathe. He stepped closer, his voice lowering. I don't think either of us wants to breathe easier anymore. The honesty in it made her heart stumble. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, as though the world had narrowed to the space between them. I don't know what this is, she whispered. I just know I don't want it to stop. Neither do I, he said. For a long moment they simply stood there. His hand brushed hers, light as snow, and she let it linger. Every inch of distance between them felt deliberate, every glance a conversation that didn't need words. The bond hummed quietly, steady and sure, a rhythm she could almost hear now if she stood still enough. When he finally spoke again, his tone was softer, almost hesitant. You should know something about the bond, he said. It grows stronger when it's acknowledged, when we let it. And if we don't? It stays quiet, he said, but it never fades. She took a slow breath, her mind racing and still at once. So it's like a promise neither of us made, but both of us kept anyway. Exactly that, she smiled faintly. You know, Lydia's going to write a book about us one day. It'll be called The Girl Who Fell for a Werewolf and Ruined His Solitude. Kellan chuckled softly. It sounds accurate. She'll probably make you more dramatic, Harper continued, her tone lightening. Maybe give you a tragic violin soundtrack. He tilted his head, the ghost of a grin appearing. Would that help? Depends, are you going to wear a cape? I could, he said, entirely too serious for her liking. She laughed, the sound spilling out like warmth, breaking the heaviness that had gathered between them. He smiled then, truly smiled, and it changed everything about his face. The quiet strength, the restraint that always lingered around him, gave way to something softer, something that looked suspiciously like joy. Don't smile like that, she said, trying to sound stern. You'll ruin your mysterious reputation. Maybe I want to ruin it, he replied. The snow outside began to fall again, soft and endless, pressing against the windows. Harper stood in the golden light of the cafe, the hum of the heater in the background, and realized how entirely she had fallen for the strange, impossible man. When he left that evening, she walked him to the door. He turned just before stepping into the snow, and met her gaze with that quiet intensity she had come to recognize. Good night, Harper, he said, his voice low and steady. Good night, Kellan. The door closed softly behind him, and she stood there for a long time, listening to the silence he left behind. Outside, she thought she heard the faint echo of a wolf's howl, low and distant, and her heart answered in the same rhythm. When Lydia came in the next morning and found Harper smiling into her coffee, she didn't even ask. He said something romantic again, didn't he? She asked, grabbing a croissant. Harper didn't deny it. Something like that. Good, Lydia said, grinning. Because honestly, you were starting to look a little too sane lately. And for the rest of the day, Harper didn't stop smiling. Not because of what Kellan had said, but because of what he hadn't needed to. Some things didn't need words. They just lived quietly between two people, steady as breath and certain as moonlight. And whatever it was that had begun between them, it was no longer a question. It was a promise. Soft, unspoken, and utterly unbreakable. Chapter 20. The morning after the storm. The storm came without warning. One moment Ashbourne was quiet and still beneath its familiar winter calm, and the next, the sky cracked open with wind and snow that swallowed everything in sight. Harper woke in the middle of the night to the sound of the trees bending and the roof creaking. For a heartbeat, she lay still, listening to the wildness outside. feeling it echo through her in a way she didn't understand. It was as if the storm itself had a pulse, his pulse. By morning, the world was transformed. Drifts of snow reached her windows, and the roads were invisible beneath the white. She wrapped herself in layers and stepped outside, breath puffing against the frozen air. The forest beyond her cabin looked like a dream of another world, quiet, endless, and full of shadows that seemed almost alive. She could feel him out there somewhere, his presence faint but steady through the strange thread that bound them. Lydia called just before noon, her voice full of exasperated energy even through the static. "You're not seriously snowed in, are you?" "Completely," Harper said, laughing softly. "The door barely opened this morning." "Perfect," Lydia replied. "That means you'll have to stay home and face your feelings instead of running the cafe like an emotionally repressed heroine. I'll bring food when the plows finally find us." Before Harper could protest, the line went dead. Typical Lydia. Part advice, part chaos. Harper smiled despite herself, setting the phone aside and turning back toward the window. Outside, the world was blindingly white, but she caught a flicker of movement between the trees. At first, she thought it was her imagination. Then, through the swirl of snow, a tall figure appeared. Dark coat, unhurried steps, the kind of presence she'd recognize anywhere. When she opened the door, the wind nearly pulled it from her hands. Kellan stood on the path, snow clinging to his hair, his eyes bright against the storm. He looked like the storm had been nothing more than a long walk. "You're insane," she said, half laughing as she pulled him inside. "You came through that?" "You felt it too," he said simply, shaking the snow from his coat. She froze. "Felt what?" "The storm," he said. "It wasn't just weather. The wolves were restless last night. Something in the air. The bond woke me." She didn't have to ask how he knew she'd felt it too. It was written in the quiet way he watched her, the unspoken understanding between them. "I thought maybe you were in trouble," he added softly. Her heart tugged at that. "You walked through a blizzard to check on me?" He shrugged, though there was warmth in his eyes. "Wolves don't like waiting." There was no real answer to that, only the rush of feeling that rose up between them. She reached for a towel to dry his hair, standing close enough to smell the faint scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. When her fingers brushed his skin, she felt the bond stir again. Stronger now, humming in the quiet, between them like a steady current. He caught her wrist gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's different today." She looked up at him. "Different how?" "Stronger," he said. "Like it's asking for something." Her breath hitched, but she didn't step away. "Maybe it just wants what we already do." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full, rich with every unspoken thing that had led them here. The storm outside beat against the windows, but inside, the world had gone utterly still. He leaned closer, slow enough to give her a choice she didn't need to think about. The kiss was soft at first, warm, careful, the kind that felt like a question and an answer at once. The world didn't shatter, but it shifted. The pulse she'd always felt deep in her chest rose and merged with his, until she couldn't tell where one heartbeat ended and the other began. When they finally drew apart, the wind had quieted. The storm was still there, but softer now, its fury spent. Kellan brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his expression gentler than she had ever seen. "You're not afraid anymore." "I was never afraid of you," she said. "Just of what I felt." He smiled faintly. "Then we're the same." They spent the rest of the day in quiet company, watching the snow settle into peace. Harper brewed coffee while he mended the fire, their conversation light and ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary after everything. They spoke of small things, the cafe, Lydia's relentless meddling, the pack's endless appetite for muffins. Every now and then, their hands brushed, and neither of them moved away. By evening, the storm had broken completely. The sky cleared into a deep violet, and moonlight spilled across the snow, silver and perfect. Harper stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold sting her cheeks. Kellan followed, standing just behind her. The night was silent except for the distant call of a wolf, low and lingering. "That's them," he said. "They know." "Know what?" "That I've chosen," he said quietly. "And that she has too." Harper turned, her heart steady. "So this is it then? The part where we stop pretending we don't belong in each other's worlds." He nodded once, his eyes on hers. "There was never a world without you in it." The words sank deep, simple and absolute. She didn't need to respond. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched the moon rise higher above the snow, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly toward tomorrow. When Lydia arrived the next morning armed with groceries and gossip, she found them sitting by the fire, laughing softly over coffee. She stopped in the doorway, taking in the sight before her, the relaxed ease, the warmth that seemed to fill the room, and let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Well," she said, setting down her bags, "it's about time. Took you too long enough to realize you're basically a rom-com waiting to happen." Harper smiled. "We're not a rom-com." Lydia grinned. "You're right, you're worse. You're one of those emotionally satisfying dramas where everyone cries and kisses under the moon." Kellan chuckled under his breath, and Harper rolled her eyes. "Don't encourage her." "I think she might be right," he said, his voice soft but amused. "Of course I'm right," Lydia said, sweeping toward the kitchen. "Now move over. I'm making breakfast for the future alpha couple." Harper gave up arguing and leaned back against Kellan, who slipped his arm around her shoulders as naturally as breathing. The bond between them pulsed softly, no longer a whisper but a steady, content rhythm. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, peaceful, as if the world itself had exhaled. For the first time since she'd met him, Harper didn't feel like she was standing between two worlds. She was exactly where she was meant to be, in the warmth of his arms, in the quiet of the storm's aftermath, beneath a moon that watched over them both. And as the morning light began to fill the room, soft and golden, Harper realized something simple and certain. She hadn't fallen in love with a monster. She had fallen in love with the man who learned to be human for her, and the wolf who would never stop guarding her heart. The storm was over, the story had only just begun. The end